Aliens expected awe. Then they saw humanity's warships. The Corvani delegation swept into the Sol system like they owned the place, which, to be fair, they pretty much did everywhere else they went. Picture this. Massive crystalline ships that weren't just built, they were grown. These things looked like someone had taken the most beautiful coral reef you've ever seen and somehow taught it to fly through space. They pulsed with colors that changed based on the ship's mood, if you can believe that. Deep blues when they were calm, brilliant golds when they were showing off, and a menacing red when they meant business. Admiral Zeftar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Radiance, watching those colors dance across his ship's living hull. He'd been doing this job for over 3 centuries, and honestly, it had gotten pretty routine. The pattern was always the same. His fleet would arrive at some backwater planet. The locals would take one look at these magnificent vessels, and within minutes they'd be begging to join the Corvani Empire. Sometimes they'd try to fight first, but that usually lasted about as long as it took for them to realize their primitive weapons couldn't even scratch the crystalline hulls. The thing about Corvani's ships wasn't just that they were beautiful, though they really were stunning. Each one was a work of art that had taken decades to cultivate. The hulls weren't made of metal or plastic, like most species used. Instead, they were living crystal that could heal itself when damaged, adapt to different environments, and even grow new sections when needed. The weapon systems were integrated so smoothly into the design that you couldn't tell where the ship ended and the armaments began. Everything flowed together like it had been painted by some cosmic artist. Zeftar had seen entire fleets surrender without firing a single shot, just because his ships were too beautiful to attack. There was something about the way the light played across those crystal surfaces, the way the colors shifted and danced, that made other species feel like they were looking at something sacred. And maybe they were. The Corvani had been perfecting their ship-growing techniques for thousands of years, treating each vessel like a beloved pet or a precious child. Today's mission was supposed to be just another routine integration. The species called themselves humans, and from what the scouts had reported, they were typical for this part of the galaxy. They just figured out faster-than-light travel a few decades ago, had a handful of colonies, and were probably still using projectile weapons like some kind of Stone Age civilization. The cultural assessment team had marked them as eager to please and likely to be grateful for guidance. In other words, exactly the kind of species that would take one look at the Eternal Radiance and immediately start asking how they could serve. The translation systems hummed to life as Zeftar prepared his usual speech. He'd given the same presentation so many times he could probably do it in his sleep. First, he'd introduce himself and explain the great honor humanity was about to receive. Then he'd outline the benefits of joining the Corvani Empire: protection, technology, access to galactic trade networks, all the usual perks. Most species were practically signing the paperwork before he finished talking. The Admiral adjusted his ceremonial robes and activated the communication array. The fabric of his outfit shifted colors to match his ship's hull, another little detail that usually impressed the locals. Everything about this first contact was designed to inspire awe. The ships, the clothes, even the way they positioned themselves in formation, it all sent the same message. The Corvani weren't just another spacefaring species. They were artists, poets, philosophers who happened to have the most powerful fleet in this part of the galaxy. But as Zeftar looked at the sensor readings from the human homeworld, something felt different this time. The energy signatures were unusual, not necessarily more advanced, just different in a way that made his technical officers frown and double-check their instruments. The humans had responded to their arrival, but instead of the usual panic transmissions or desperate attempt to hide, there was just silence. Not the silence of fear, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of Zeftar's neck stand up, if he'd had hair. Still, he'd done this 1,000 times before. Show up, look magnificent, accept the inevitable surrender, then get back home in time for the evening feast. What could possibly go wrong? But something was wrong. The human response didn't come as words or desperate pleas for mercy. Instead, space itself seemed to tear open as geometric monsters materialized from nowhere. These weren't ships. They were floating metal nightmares that looked like someone had taken industrial equipment and welded guns to every available surface. Captain Blake Morrison's voice came through the comm channels with the kind of casual friendliness that immediately set off every alarm bell in Zeftar's head. "Welcome to human space," Morrison said, as his ship's targeting systems lit up every Corvani vessel like a Christmas tree. Admiral Zeftar stared at the tactical display, blinking rapidly as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. Where moments before there had been empty space, now there were things. He hesitated to even call them ships because they looked nothing like any vessel he'd encountered in 3 centuries of space travel. The human constructs were angular, brutal, and completely without grace. They looked like someone had taken a factory, stretched it out, and then stuck weapon systems on every flat surface they could find. The lead human vessel identified itself as the UES Retribution, and it was easily twice the size of Zeftar's flagship. But size wasn't what made his hands shake as he gripped the command console. It was a complete and utter lack of beauty in the design. Where Corvani ships flowed like living art, these human vessels looked like they'd been assembled by someone who thought aesthetics were a waste of time. Every surface was flat, gray, and covered in what his sensors identified as weapon emplacements. Lots and lots of weapon emplacements. Captain Morrison's voice came through the speakers again, still maintaining that unsettling, cheerful tone. "Sorry about the dramatic entrance. Folks, we've been tracking your approach for the last few days, and we figured we should roll out the welcome wagon." The way he said it made it sound like humans regularly had alien fleets dropping by for tea and cookies, rather than facing what should have been the most important moment in their species' history. Zeftar's communication officer, a young Corvani named Sylvan, leaned over and whispered, "Admiral, our sensors are detecting at least 47 distinct weapon systems on that lead ship alone. And, sir, they're all pointed at us." The poor officer's crystalline features had shifted to a pale blue color that indicated extreme nervousness. What made it worse was how casual the humans seemed about the whole situation. The Retribution's hull was scarred and pitted, like it had been through countless battles and somehow kept flying anyway. There were patches welded over what looked like massive holes, and entire sections that appeared to have been rebuilt with whatever materials were handy at the time. This was a ceremonial vessel designed to impress visitors. This was a working ship that had seen serious action. More human voices joined the conversation as additional ships revealed themselves. Commander Lisa Harper from something called the UES Vindication introduced herself with the same friendly tone, followed by Captain David Walsh from the UES Defiance. Each ship that announced itself was larger and more heavily armed than the last. The humans were treating this like some kind of neighborhood block party, chatting amongst themselves about patrol schedules and maintenance reports, while their vessels maintained target locks on every single Corvani ship. The tactical display showed dozens of red warning indicators as the Corvani sensors tried to catalog the human weapons. Rail guns, missile systems, energy weapons, and several types of armament that didn't match anything in their databases. The sheer number of weapons on each ship was staggering. It was like the humans had looked at their ships during the design phase and asked themselves, how can we fit more guns on this thing? What really bothered Zeftar wasn't just the weapons. It was how the humans carried themselves. There was no boasting, no threats, no attempt to intimidate. They were just polite, friendly, even. Captain Morrison was asking about their journey, wondering if they needed any supplies, offering to provide star charts for the local area. It was the kind of conversation you'd have with neighbors who dropped by unexpectedly, except these neighbors happened to be pointing enough firepower at you to turn your entire fleet into space dust. The human ships hung in space with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they held all the cards. Their positioning wasn't random. Zeftar's tactical computer highlighted how they'd arranged themselves to cover every possible escape route, while making it look like a casual formation. These humans knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it with a kind of relaxed competence that suggested this wasn't their first time dealing with uninvited guests. As the reality of the situation sank in, Zeftar realized that everything the Corvani scouts had reported about humanity was completely wrong. These weren't primitive beings who would be grateful for guidance. These were apex predators who'd been polite enough to let them get close before revealing their true nature. The humans called their lead ship the UES Retribution, and it bristled with so many weapons that the Corvani computers gave up trying to count them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when more human ships began appearing, Not decloaking, not emerging from hyperspace, just suddenly being there like they'd been hiding behind reality itself. Commander Nora Hayes transmitted from a U.S. Vindication, her tone so polite it was almost insulting. "We'd love to chat about your intentions out here," she said, while her dreadnought's missile bays opened like the mouth of some mechanical beast. Zeftar watched his tactical officer's face go through several shades of blue as the computer system struggled to process what they were seeing. The weapon count on the Retribution had started at 23 distinct systems, then jumped to 41, then 67, before the display simply showed an error message and gave up entirely. The ship's hull was so covered in gun barrels, missile tubes, and energy weapon emitters that it looked like someone had taken a normal vessel and dipped it in weapons like chocolate coating. But the Retribution was intimidating. What happened next made Zeftar's blood run cold. Space around them began to fill with more human ships, and they weren't arriving through any method the Corvani recognized. These vessels weren't dropping out of hyperspace with the usual energy signatures and dimensional tears. They weren't decloaking with the telltale shimmer of stealth fields either. They were just appearing. One moment empty space. The next moment a massive human dreadnought, sitting there like it had been waiting patiently for the right time to join the conversation. The first to announce itself was the U.S. Vindication, commanded by someone who introduced herself as Commander Nora Hayes. Her voice had that same unsettling friendliness that seemed to be a human trademark, but there was something underneath it that made Zeftar's skin crawl. She sounded like a teacher talking to a student who'd been caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing. "We'd love to chat about your intentions out here," Hayes said, and as she spoke, her ship began what could only be described as a casual weapons demonstration. The Vindication's missile bays opened slowly, revealing rows upon rows of launch tubes that seemed to go on forever. Each bay was the size of a Corvani fighter craft, and there were dozens of them. The sight was hypnotic and terrifying, like watching the mouth of some enormous predator slowly open to reveal its teeth. More ships kept materializing around them. The U.S. Defiance appeared off their port side, followed by the U.S. Vengeance, then the U.S. Stalwart. Each one was larger than the last, and each one was absolutely covered in weapons. The humans seemed to have a philosophy that if you had space on your hull, you should put a gun there. If you didn't have space, you should make some and put 2 guns there. What made it even more unnerving was how the human commanders talked to each other. They were having casual conversations across open channels, discussing patrol schedules, maintenance rotations, and who was bringing coffee to the next briefing. Captain Ryan Fletcher from the Defiance was apparently dealing with a reactor that was running 3% below optimal, and Commander Kelly Brooks from the Stalwart was reminding everyone about some kind of poker game schedule for tomorrow night. They were treating the arrival of a powerful alien fleet like a minor interruption to their daily routine. It was the kind of conversation you'd overhear at any workplace, except this workplace happened to be a collection of warships that could probably level planets without breaking a sweat. Zeftar Sensor's officer finally managed to get partial readings on the human vessels, and the numbers were staggering. The smallest ship in their formation carried more firepower than most Corvani battlecruisers. The largest ones were showing energy signatures that shouldn't have been possible for vessels of their size. Either human technology was far more advanced than anyone had realized, or they'd found ways to pack weapons into their ships that defied several laws of physics. The way the ships had appeared was particularly troubling. Corvani stealth technology was considered among the best in the galaxy, but it relied on bending light and energy around the vessel. These human ships hadn't been using stealth. They'd been using something else entirely. Something that let them sit in normal space completely undetected until they chose to reveal themselves. Commander Hayes' voice cut through his thoughts again. "Now, I don't want to seem rude," she said, still maintaining that terrifyingly polite tone. "But we're curious about what brings so many armed vessels to our neighborhood. We're always happy to meet new friends, but we do like to know what their intentions are." As she spoke, more human ships continued to appear. The U.S. Thunderbolt, the U.S. Hammer, the U.S. Righteous Fury. Each name seemed designed to make it clear that these weren't exploration vessels or diplomatic ships. These were warships, pure and simple, built by a species that apparently took the concept of overwhelming firepower and turned it into an art form. The Corvani had expected to find a primitive species that would be grateful for protection and guidance. Instead, they'd stumbled into a trap set by apex predators who were polite enough to ask questions before they started shooting. Zeftar tried to salvage the situation by explaining Corvani's superiority and the natural order of things. The humans listened patiently. Then Captain Wade Fletcher from the UES Defiance asked if they'd like a demonstration of human defensive capabilities. What followed wasn't a weapons test. It was a masterclass in control violence. The humans didn't use energy weapons or plasma like civilized species. They fired chunks of metal at speeds that shouldn't have been possible, turning nearby asteroids into glowing clouds of vapor while chatting about the weather. Admiral Zeftar straightened his ceremonial robes and activated his most diplomatic voice. He'd been in situations like this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. Sometimes younger species got a bit too confident when they first encountered advanced technology. A gentle reminder about the natural order of the galaxy usually brought them back to reality pretty quickly. "Honor humans," he began, his translator rendering his words in what he hoped was an appropriately respectful tone. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding here. The Corvani Empire has been shepherding younger civilizations for over 10,000 years. We brought peace, prosperity, and protection to countless worlds across this sector of the galaxy." The human commanders listened politely, not interrupting once. Captain Morrison from the Retribution even made encouraging noises at appropriate moments, like he was genuinely interested in what Zeftar had to say. It was almost refreshing. Really, most species either surrendered immediately or started shooting. These humans seemed willing to have an actual conversation about their future. "You see," Zeftar continued, warming to his theme, "the galaxy can be a dangerous place for developing species. There are raiders, hostile empires, cosmic phenomena that can wipe out entire civilizations. Under Corvani protection, humanity would be safe to grow and prosper without these concerns. We ask for very little in return, just recognition of our authority and a small tribute to help maintain the fleet that keeps everyone safe." Commander Hayes from the Vindication spoke up, her tone curious rather than hostile. "That's very generous of you, Admiral. We appreciate the offer, we really do. But we've gotten pretty good at handling our own defense needs. Would you like us to show you what we mean?" Before Zeftar could respond, Captain Wade Fletcher from the UES Defiance jumped into conversation. "Oh, that's a great idea, Nora. Admiral, we'd be happy to give you a demonstration of our defensive capabilities. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to show you what we're working with. Would that be all right?" The Corvani Admiral found himself nodding before he quite realized what he was agreeing to. The humans were being so polite, so reasonable, that it seemed rude to refuse. Yes, that would be acceptable. A small demonstration would help us understand your current technological level. What happened next would haunt Zeftar's dreams for the rest of his very long life. Captain Fletcher's voice came across the comm with the same casual friendliness he'd been using all along. "All right, everybody, let's show our guests what we've been working on. Target selection is, let's see, how about that nice big asteroid cluster about 50,000 kilometers out? The one with the metallic composition." "Copy that, Wade," came Commander Hayes' reply. "Vindication is locked and loaded. On your mark." "Roger. Firing in 3, 2, 1 mark." The Corvani sensors registered the launch, but what they detected made no sense. The humans weren't firing energy beams or plasma bolts like every other civilized species in the galaxy. They were shooting solid objects. Chunks of metal accelerated to velocities that the Corvani computers initially flagged as sensor errors. The projectiles crossed 50,000 kilometers in less time than it took Zeftar to blink. When they hit the asteroid cluster, the results were spectacular and terrifying. The solid rocks simply disappeared, not destroyed in the traditional sense, but converted instantly into expanding clouds of superheated gas and glowing vapor that lit up the surrounding space like tiny stars. "Nice grouping, everyone," Fletcher commented, like he was discussing the result of a casual target practice session. "Temperature readings are showing about 12,000 degrees at the impact sites. Not bad for a cold start exercise." Commander Kelly Brooks from the Stalwart chimed in cheerfully. "Hey, Wade, did you see that reading spike on your third shot? Might want to have your gunners check the calibration on Tube 7. Looked like it was running a little hot. Thanks, Kelly. I'll have them take a look after we're done here. While the humans discussed maintenance schedules and firing solutions like they were talking about grocery lists, Zeftar stared at the glowing clouds where a substantial asteroid field had existed moments before. His tactical officer was making small whimpering sounds as he tried to calculate the kinetic energy involved in the demonstration. The humans had just casually vaporized several million tons of solid rock while having a friendly conversation about weapon maintenance. And they'd done it with what amounted to throwing rocks. Very, very fast rocks. But still just solid projectiles rather than the sophisticated energy weapons that define advanced civilizations. It was primitive. It was brutal. It was absolutely terrifying in its simplicity and effectiveness. So, Captain Morrison's voice cut through Zeftar's shock, still maintaining that unsettling friendly tone. We appreciate the offer of protection, Admiral, but as you can see, we got things pretty well handled on our own. The Corvani retreat became legendary, not because they ran, but because of what the humans did as they left. Commander Trevor Walsh transmitted complete technical specifications of every weapon system they'd observed, detailed schematics of human ship designs, and a cheerful invitation to come back anytime. The message was crystal clear. Humanity wasn't trying to hide their capabilities because they didn't need to. Within hours, Corvani Space carried a new warning about the Sol system. Approach with extreme caution, because humans apparently built their ships with the express purpose of making other species question their life choices. Admiral Zeftar stood on his bridge, watching the human fleet maintain their casual formation as the Corvani ships began their withdrawal. His hands were still shaking slightly from what he'd witnessed, and his tactical officers were huddled around their stations, double-checking sensor readings that couldn't possibly be correct. The asteroid demonstration had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had completely shattered everything the Corvani thought they knew about galactic power structures. Then Commander Trevor Walsh from something called the UES Harbinger did something that will be talked about in Corvani military academies for generations to come. Instead of letting them leave with their tails between their legs, he opened a direct transmission channel and started talking like they were old friends wrapping up a pleasant social visit. Admiral Zeftar, before you head out, we thought you might appreciate some reading material for the journey home, Walsh said, his tone so friendly it was almost insulting. We're transmitting complete technical specifications for everything you saw today. Weapon yields, firing rates, ammunition types, power requirements, the whole package. Consider it a goodwill gesture. The Corvani communication officer looked at Zeftar with pure panic in his crystalline features. Accepting technical data from an unknown species was against about 17 different military protocols. But refusing seemed even more dangerous at this point. So Zeftar nodded weakly and watched as terabytes of information began flooding their systems. What came through wasn't just basic specifications. It was everything. Detailed schematics showing how human railguns achieve their impossible velocities. Power distribution charts that revealed how they managed to fit so many weapons on each ship, manufacturing processes, material compositions, even maintenance schedules and crew training requirements. The humans were essentially handing over their entire military playbook, like it was a tourist brochure. Captain Morrison from the Retribution joined the conversation, adding his own cheerful commentary. Oh, and Trevor, don't forget to include the defensive specs too. Our shields, armor plating, point defense systems. The works. We want our new Corvani friends to have the complete picture. Good thinking, Blake, Walsh replied. Admiral, we're also including detailed information about our defensive capabilities. Hull composition, energy shielding, damage control procedures. Everything you need to know if you're planning some kind of military action, which we're sure you're not. But hey, better safe than sorry, right? The most terrifying part wasn't the technical data itself. It was a casual way the humans were sharing it. They weren't being generous or naive. They were being confident. Supremely, terrifyingly confident. They were showing their hand completely because they knew it didn't matter. Even if every other species in the galaxy knew exactly how human weapons worked, it wouldn't make a difference. Commander Hayes from the Vindication added the final touch to the psychological masterpiece. And Admiral, please don't be a stranger. Human space is always open to peaceful visitors. We've got some beautiful colonies you might enjoy seeing, and our diplomatic corps would love to establish formal relations with the Corvani Empire. Just give us a heads up next time, so we can roll out the proper welcome mat." As the Corvani fleet limped away from Sol, their computers were still processing the mountain of technical data the humans had casually dumped on them. The information painted a picture that made Zeftar's worst nightmares look optimistic. The human ships they'd encountered weren't even their best ones. They were patrol vessels, the equivalent of police cars. The real warships, according to the schematics, made the UES Retribution look like a pleasure craft. Within 6 hours of the Corvani fleet's return to their home system, emergency broadcasts were going out across the Empire. New navigation protocols were hastily implemented, with specific warnings about the Sol system and surrounding space. The official designation read, "Human space, approach with extreme caution. Species demonstrates advanced military capabilities and concerning levels of confidence in said capabilities." The unofficial warnings that spread through Corvani military channels were far more colorful. Junior officers whispered about ships that could turn planets into gravel and humans who handed out weapon specifications like party favors. Senior commanders found themselves dealing with the uncomfortable realization that their beautiful, artistic vessels might as well have been made of paper when faced with human engineering philosophy. Within days, similar warnings were spreading throughout Corvani client states and allied species. The message was always the same. Humanity had entered the galactic stage, and they hadn't come to ask permission. They'd come to politely inform everyone else that the rules of the game had just changed, and they were confident enough in their position to publish the new rulebook for anyone interested in reading it. The age of Corvani dominance was over. The age of humanity had begun, and they'd announce it with the kind of casual confidence that only came from knowing you were holding all the cards.